Welcome to Sleepless Survivors. Tonight we journey through the annals of history to explore the cities that fell beneath the waters, the civilizations swallowed by floods, and the stories of destruction and rebirth that have shaped our world. Let the gentle rhythm of these tales carry you into peaceful slumber. Close your eyes, settle into comfort, and let us begin our journey through time and tide. The water rises slowly at first, a gentle lapping against stone foundations, a creeping dampness that seeps through ancient streets. But then comes the deluge, the overwhelming force of nature that has throughout human history claimed entire cities, entire civilizations, entire ways of life. Tonight we explore these lost worlds, these drowned metropolises, these cities destroyed by the flood. Let your breathing slow as we descend into these submerged stories. Feel yourself drifting, floating, as we explore the depths of history. Part 1. The Ancient Warnings. Long before recorded history began, humanity understood the power of water. Our earliest ancestors settled near rivers, lakes and seas, drawn by the life-giving properties of water. But they also learned to fear it. They learned that water could take as easily as it could give. The oldest flood stories come to us from Mesopotamia, that fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, in what is now modern-day Iraq, some of humanity's first great cities rose from the alluvial plains, and here too they learned the devastating power of flooding. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature, tells of a great flood. In this ancient tale, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a catastrophic deluge. Only Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea, survives by building a great boat. For 6 days and 6 nights the storm rages. The waters rise, cities disappear, and when the flood finally subsides, only Utnapishtim and those aboard his vessel remain. This story, carved into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, reflects a deep cultural memory of devastating floods. The Mesopotamian plains were prone to flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates, unpredictable and fierce, would overflow their banks without warning. Entire settlements could be washed away in a single night. Archaeological evidence confirms these ancient fears. Layers of flood deposits have been found in ancient Mesopotamian sites. Thick bands of clean clay separating layers of human habitation. Evidence of catastrophic flooding events that buried cities beneath mud and silt. Let yourself sink deeper into relaxation as we explore these ancient waters. The city of one of Mesopotamia's greatest urban centres, experienced multiple devastating floods throughout its long history. Founded around 3800 BCE, was a thriving metropolis, home to tens of thousands of people. Its ziggurat rose majestically above the plain, a testament to human ambition and architectural prowess. But was built on a floodplain, and the rivers that gave it life also threatened its existence. Archaeological excavations in the 1920s, led by Sir Leonard Woolley, uncovered dramatic evidence of ancient flooding. Woolley discovered a layer of clean, water-deposited clay over 8 feet thick. This layer separated earlier settlements from later ones. It was evidence of a catastrophic flood, one so severe it had buried the earlier city entirely. Woolley believed he had found evidence of the biblical flood, the deluge described in Genesis. While modern archaeologists are more cautious in their interpretations, the evidence of severe flooding is undeniable. Experienced multiple devastating floods throughout its history. Each time the city rebuilt, each time the inhabitants returned to the same dangerous location. Why? Because the rivers that threatened them also sustained them. The floods that destroyed their homes also deposited rich, fertile soil. The same waters that brought devastation brought life. This is the paradox at the heart of humanity's relationship with water. We are drawn to it. We need it, but it can destroy us. Feel the weight of centuries pressing down. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort. Part 2. The Lost City of Heracleion. Now we journey to the Mediterranean, to the coast of Egypt, where beneath the waves lies one of antiquity's most magnificent lost cities, Heracleion. For centuries, Heracleion existed only in ancient texts. Greek historians mentioned a great port city at the mouth of the Nile, a place of temples and prosperity, where ships from across the Mediterranean came to trade. But no physical evidence of this city had ever been found. It had vanished so completely that many scholars believed it was merely legendary. Then, in 2000, French archaeologist Frank Goddio made a remarkable discovery. Using sophisticated sonar equipment, his team detected anomalies on the seafloor in Abu Qir Bay, about 30 feet beneath the Mediterranean waters. When divers descended to investigate, they found themselves swimming through the ruins of an ancient city. Heracleion had been found. What they discovered was breathtaking. Colossal statues lay toppled on the seafloor. Massive stone blocks from temples and civic buildings were scattered across the seabed. Anchors, coins, jewellery and ceramics lay where they had fallen over 2,000 years ago. An entire city, frozen in time beneath the waves. Heracleion, also known by its Egyptian name Thonis, was founded around the 8th century BCE. It was built on a network of islands and channels in the Nile Delta, similar to Venice. The city served as Egypt's main port before the founding of Alexandria. Ships carrying goods from across the Mediterranean would stop here first, paying taxes and duties before continuing up the Nile. The city was dominated by a massive temple to Amun-Gereb. Colossal statues of gods and pharaohs lined the waterways. Merchants from Greece, Phoenicia and beyond walked its streets. It was a cosmopolitan hub, a place where cultures mingled and prospered. But Heracleion was built on unstable ground. The Nile Delta consists of soft, waterlogged sediment. The city's massive stone structures were gradually sinking into this unstable foundation. Earthquakes, common in the region, accelerated the process. The ground liquefied, buildings tilted and collapsed, and then came the water. Let the image of that drowned city calm your thoughts. Imagine swimming through ancient streets where fish now dart between fallen columns. The destruction of Heracleion was gradual, but the end was catastrophic. Over several centuries, the land beneath the city subsided. The channels and waterways that made Heracleion prosperous also made it vulnerable. During the 8th century CE, a series of earthquakes struck the region. The already unstable ground liquefied completely. Entire neighbourhoods slid into the sea. The great temple collapsed. The colossal statues toppled. Within a matter of days, most of Heracleion was submerged. The survivors fled. The city that had stood for over a millennium disappeared beneath the waves. Sand and silt quickly covered the ruins. Within a generation, the location of the city was forgotten. It became a legend, a story of a lost golden age. But beneath the Mediterranean, Heracleion endured. The water that destroyed it also preserved it. Sealed beneath sand and silt, protected from oxygen and light, the ruins remained remarkably intact. The statues that would have crumbled in air remained solid underwater. Organic materials that would have rotted away on land survived in the anaerobic environment of the seabed. The divers exploring Heracleion today swim through a perfectly preserved snapshot of ancient life. They pass through the remains of houses where families once lived. They see the goods that merchants once traded, still stored in ceramic jars. They find the offerings that priests once made to the gods, still lying before toppled altars. In one area of the ruins, archaeologists discovered a series of limestone slabs covered in hieroglyphics. These were decrees issued by pharaohs, laws that governed the city. One particularly important find was a stone stele that confirmed Heracleion and Thonis were two names for the same city, solving a mystery that had puzzled historians for decades. The discovery of Heracleion has revolutionized our understanding of ancient Egypt and Mediterranean trade. It has revealed a sophisticated cosmopolitan world that existed at the intersection of Egyptian and Greek civilizations, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the impermanence of even our greatest achievements. Let yourself drift deeper, as deep as those ancient ruins beneath the Mediterranean. Part 3. The Deluge of Ancient China. We travel now to the Yellow River Valley of ancient China, where some of the world's most devastating floods have occurred throughout history. The Yellow River, known as the Mother River of Chinese civilization, has also been called China's Sorrow because of its catastrophic floods. The river gets its name from the massive amounts of yellow-brown sediment it carries, eroded from the Los Plateau. This sediment makes the surrounding floodplains incredibly fertile, which is why Chinese civilization first flourished along its banks. But the sediment also raises the riverbed, sometimes to heights above the surrounding countryside. When the river floods, the results are catastrophic. Chinese historical records document thousands of significant floods over the past few millennia, but some stand out for their sheer destructive power and the number of lives lost. In 1887, the Yellow River experienced one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. Months of heavy rainfall had swollen the river beyond its banks. The dikes that were supposed to contain the water began to fail. In Huayang, Henan province, the dikes finally gave way. Water burst through the breach with tremendous force. A wall of water surged across the countryside. Villages disappeared in minutes. Fields that had been carefully tended for generations vanished beneath muddy floodwaters. Cities that had stood for centuries were inundated. The flood created a new course for the Yellow River, shifting its mouth hundreds of miles to the south. An area of about 50,000 square miles was completely flooded. Approximately 2 million people died, either drowned in the initial flooding or victims of the famine and disease that followed. Let your mind float on these ancient waters, drifting peacefully. The ancient city of Kaifeng has a unique and tragic relationship with flooding. Located on the Yellow River's floodplain, Kaifeng served as the capital of several Chinese dynasties. During the Song dynasty, from the 10th to 12th centuries, it was one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world, with a population exceeding 1 million people. But Kaifeng has been catastrophically flooded 6 times in its history, each time buried under layers of mud and silt. The city has been rebuilt 6 times, each time on top of the ruins of the previous incarnation. Today, the ancient Song dynasty city lies buried under 30 feet of sediment, with later versions of Kaifeng built in layers above it. The most devastating flood occurred in 1642, during the late Ming dynasty. The city was under siege by rebel forces. The Ming garrison commander, in a desperate attempt to break the siege, ordered the deliberate destruction of the dikes holding back the Yellow River. His plan was to flood the rebel camps. The strategy backfired catastrophically. When the dikes were breached, the Yellow River surged through with overwhelming force. The water didn't just flood the rebel positions, it inundated the entire city of Kaifeng. Estimates suggest that between 300,000 and 600,000 people perished in the flood. The city was almost completely destroyed. For 3 years, Kaifeng remained submerged. When the waters finally receded, the survivors returned to find their once great city buried in mud. The magnificent palaces and temples were gone. The bustling markets were silent. The libraries and academies, centres of learning and culture, had vanished beneath the silt. But the survivors rebuilt. They cleared what they could and built new structures on top of the ruins. This pattern has repeated throughout Kaifeng's history. Each catastrophic flood buries the old city and creates the foundation for the new one. Archaeologists excavating in Kaifeng have found layer upon layer of urban remains, a vertical timeline of repeated destruction and rebirth. Feel yourself sinking through these layers of history, through flood upon flood, deeper into peaceful rest. Part 4. Pompeii's Wet Fate. Most people know Pompeii as the Roman city buried by volcanic ash when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE. But recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that water played a far more significant role in the city's destruction than previously understood. When Vesuvius erupted, it didn't simply rain ash on Pompeii. The eruption triggered a series of pyroclastic surges, superheated clouds of gas, ash and rock that raced down the mountainside at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. But these surges weren't dry. They contained enormous amounts of water vapour. When these surges reached Pompeii, they didn't just bury the city, they flooded it. The superheated water vapour condensed instantly upon contact with cooler surfaces, creating flash floods of boiling water mixed with ash and pumice. These floods surged through the streets, smashing through doors and windows, filling rooms from floor to ceiling. Recent excavations have revealed evidence of these water surges throughout Pompeii. Sediment deposits show clear signs of water flow. Bodies were found in positions suggesting they were swept away by rushing water before being buried. Debris is distributed in patterns consistent with flooding rather than simple ashfall. The people of Pompeii faced a multifaceted catastrophe. Ash rained from the sky, burying the city in darkness. Earthquakes shook the ground. Toxic gases poisoned the air, and water, superheated ash-laden water, surged through the streets, drowning those who had survived the initial eruption. Let these ancient waters wash away your tension, carrying you towards sleep. But Pompeii's relationship with water-related disasters didn't begin with Vesuvius's eruption. The city had experienced devastating floods before, and these earlier disasters may have contributed to the catastrophic death toll in 79 CE. 17 years before the eruption, in 62 CE, a powerful earthquake struck the region. This earthquake caused significant damage throughout Pompeii and the surrounding area, but it also damaged the city's water infrastructure. Pompeii had a sophisticated water system. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mountains. An extensive network of lead pipes distributed water throughout the city. Public fountains provided water for those without private connections. Public baths were centres of social life. The earthquake of 62 CE severely damaged this system. Aqueducts collapsed. Pipes broke. Water distribution was disrupted. But more significantly, the earthquake damaged the drainage systems that carried wastewater and stormwater out of the city. In the years between the earthquake and the final eruption, Pompeii struggled to fully repair its infrastructure. When heavy rains came, the inadequate drainage systems couldn't handle the water. Streets flooded, water seeped into buildings, the ground became saturated. Archaeological evidence suggests that in the years before the eruption, Pompeii experienced several significant flooding events. Sediment layers indicate periods when parts of the city were inundated with water. Some buildings show evidence of water damage that was being repaired when Vesuvius erupted. This pre-existing water damage may have made buildings more vulnerable during the eruption. Structures weakened by flooding collapsed more easily under the weight of ash and pumice. Damaged drainage systems allowed floodwaters from the pyroclastic surges to accumulate rather than drain away. The destruction of Pompeii was thus not a single catastrophe, but a cascade of disasters, with water playing a crucial role throughout. Feel the weight of ash and water, pressing you down into deeper relaxation. Part 5. Rungholt, the Atlantis of the North. In the cold waters of the North Sea, off the coast of Germany, lie the remains of Rungholt, sometimes called the Atlantis of the North. This wealthy medieval port city was destroyed in a single night by one of history's most devastating storm surges. Rungholt was located on the island of Strand in what was then the Duchy of Schleswig. During the medieval period, it was a prosperous trading centre. The surrounding marshlands were protected by an extensive system of dikes. Behind these dikes, the land had been reclaimed from the sea and converted into productive farmland and pastures. The region was wealthy. Salt harvested from the marshes made fortunes for merchants. Ships from across northern Europe came to trade. The population of Rungholt and the surrounding area may have exceeded 10,000 people, making it one of the larger settlements in northern Europe at the time. But the prosperity came at a cost. The land was barely above sea level. Only the dikes stood between the inhabitants and the North Sea, and the dikes required constant maintenance. In January 1362, a massive storm struck northern Europe. This storm, known as the Grote Mandrenke, or Great Drowning of Men, was one of the most devastating natural disasters in European history. The storm struck at the worst possible time. It was high tide. The wind drove the sea against the coast with tremendous force. The storm surge, the abnormal rise in sea level, caused by the storm, reached heights of 16 feet or more above normal high tide levels. The dikes couldn't withstand the force. One by one, they failed. The North Sea poured through the breaches, reclaiming land that had been taken from it. Rungholt was in the path of the surge. Walls of water crashed through the dikes protecting the city. In the darkness of the storm, with wind and rain obscuring vision, the inhabitants had no chance to escape. The city was inundated within minutes. Buildings collapsed under the force of the water. People were swept away. When dawn finally came and the storm subsided, Rungholt was gone. The entire island of Strand had been torn apart. What had been a single large island was now a scattering of smaller islands and shoals. An estimated 25,000 people had died along the North Sea coast. Rungholt and dozens of other settlements had simply vanished. Let the storm winds quiet in your mind. Let the waters still. Let yourself drift into peace. For centuries after its destruction, Rungholt existed only in legend and folk tales. Stories told of a wealthy city that had been punished for its sins, swallowed by the sea in a single night. Some versions claimed that on quiet nights you could hear the church bells of Rungholt ringing beneath the waves. But Rungholt was more than legend. In the centuries following its destruction, fishermen occasionally brought up fragments of brick and pottery in their nets. During extremely low tides, ruins would sometimes be briefly visible above the water. Then, in the 90s, a severe storm eroded the seabed, exposing substantial ruins. Archaeologists rushed to document what they could before the sea reclaimed them. They found the remains of houses, dikes, and a sophisticated drainage system. They recovered pottery, tools, and other artifacts that confirmed the historical accounts of a wealthy medieval city. More recently, modern survey techniques have revealed the extent of the ruins. Beneath the North Sea, buried under sand and silt, lies the entire layout of medieval Rungholt. The streets can be mapped. The locations of major buildings can be determined. It's a perfectly preserved snapshot of medieval urban life, frozen at the moment of catastrophe. The destruction of Rungholt had far-reaching consequences. The storm surge of 1362 permanently altered the coastline of northern Europe. It created new bays and inlets. It changed trade routes. It demonstrated the vulnerability of low-lying coastal areas to storm surges. In the aftermath of the disaster, coastal communities along the North Sea invested heavily in improved dike systems. They developed more sophisticated techniques for managing water and protecting reclaimed land. The lessons learned from Rungholt's destruction shaped coastal engineering for centuries, but the fundamental vulnerability remained. People continued to live on land barely above sea level, protected only by dikes, always at risk from the next great storm. Feel yourself protected, safe, as you sink deeper into rest. Part 6. The Johnstown Flood. We journey now to America, to the mountains of Pennsylvania, where in 1889 one of the country's deadliest disasters unfolded when the South Fork Dam failed, sending a wall of water crashing down on the city of Johnstown. Johnstown was a prosperous steel town, nestled in a valley where the Little Conemaugh River and Stony Creek River met. The valley was narrow, with steep mountains rising on either side. This geography made Johnstown vulnerable to flooding even under normal circumstances. But what happened on May 30th, 1889, was far from normal. 14 miles upstream from Johnstown was the South Fork Dam, which created Lake Conemaugh. This artificial lake was owned by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, an exclusive resort for wealthy Pittsburgh industrialists, including Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. The dam had a troubled history. Originally built in the 1850s, it had been poorly maintained for decades. When the club purchased it in 1879, they made modifications that further compromised its integrity. They lowered the dam's height to allow a road to cross the top. They removed important discharge pipes to prevent their prize fish from escaping. They installed screens across the spillway that caught debris and reduced its capacity. Engineers who inspected the dam warned that it was dangerous, but the club ignored these warnings. The dam was good enough, they believed. It had held for decades. Surely it would continue to hold. In late May 1889, heavy rains fell across Pennsylvania. The ground became saturated. Streams and rivers swelled. Lake Conemaugh rose steadily behind the South Fork Dam. On May 31st, it continued to rain. The lake rose higher. Water began flowing over the top of the dam. Workers at the club tried desperately to relieve the pressure, digging channels and clearing the spillway. But the debris-clogged spillway couldn't handle the flow. The water rose faster than they could manage it. At 3:10 p.m, the South Fork Dam failed catastrophically. 20 million tons of water exploded through the breach, unleashing a flood of biblical proportions. Let the tension drain from your body like water through that broken dam. The wall of water that burst from Lake Conemaugh was 60 feet high in places. It travelled at speeds up to 40 miles per hour. It carried with it trees, boulders, houses, and anything else in its path. The massive debris acted like a battering ram, adding to the destructive power. The flood roared down the valley toward Johnstown. Along the way, it destroyed several small towns. In Mineral Point, the water was so powerful it swept houses from their foundations and carried them downstream like toys. In East Conemaugh, a locomotive engineer named John Hess saw the flood coming. Instead of fleeing, he tied down his train's whistle and sent it screaming down the tracks toward Johnstown, warning everyone in its path. Hess died in the flood, but his warning saved countless lives. Despite Hess's heroic effort, most people in Johnstown had no warning or only minutes to seek safety. At 4:07 p.m, the wall of water struck the city. Imagine for a moment what that must have been like. You're going about your Friday afternoon. Perhaps you're at work in one of the steel mills. Perhaps you're at home with your family. Perhaps you're shopping in town. The day is rainy and dreary, but nothing seems particularly alarming. Then you hear a sound. A low rumble at first, like distant thunder, but it grows louder. It becomes a roar. The ground begins to shake. People start running, shouting. You look toward the valley above town and see it, a wall of dark water churning with debris bearing down on the city like an avalanche. There's no time to think, only to run, to seek higher ground, to grab your children and flee. But there isn't enough time. There isn't enough warning. The water moves too fast. The flood hit Johnstown with the force of a bomb. Buildings exploded into splinters. Locomotives were tossed aside. Entire blocks of the city were scoured clean. The buildings ripped from their foundations and swept away. The water was so powerful that it stripped bark from trees and skin from bodies. The debris created temporary dams that would then burst, sending new surges through the city. At the Pennsylvania Railroad's stone bridge below town, a massive pile of wreckage, buildings, trees, train cars and people, piled up 70 feet high. Then this debris caught fire, incinerating people who had survived the flood but were trapped in the wreckage. Let these terrible images fade as you drift deeper into peaceful sleep. When the water finally receded, Johnstown was devastated. The city centre had been almost completely destroyed. Over 200 people were dead, including 99 entire families. Hundreds of bodies were never found, swept downstream and buried in mud. The property damage exceeded $17 million, an astronomical sum at the time. In the aftermath, the story of the Johnstown flood captured national attention. It was one of the first major disasters covered extensively by the modern press. Photographers documented the devastation. Reporters interviewed survivors. The images and stories shocked the nation. Relief efforts were unprecedented. Clara Barton and the American Red Cross arrived within days. This was one of the first major disaster relief operations in American history. Donations poured in from across the country and around the world. The relief effort helped establish the Red Cross as America's premier disaster relief organization. But Americans also wanted accountability. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had owned the dam. Their negligence had caused the disaster. Surely they should be held responsible. However, the club members were some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America. They hired the best lawyers. They argued that the flood was an act of God, and unforeseeable natural disaster for which they couldn't be held liable. Despite overwhelming evidence of their negligence, no club member was ever held legally responsible. None paid damages to the victims. This lack of accountability outraged many Americans. It highlighted the gap between the wealthy elite and ordinary citizens. It demonstrated how the powerful could escape consequences that would destroy ordinary people. The Johnstown flood remains one of America's deadliest disasters. It's a story of both terrible tragedy and remarkable resilience. The survivors rebuilt their city. Within a decade, Johnstown had recovered and was again a thriving steel town. But the memory of that terrible day endured. "Don't forget to duck" became a grim local joke, referring to the need to avoid debris in any future flood. And Johnstown would flood again, multiple times in the 20th century, though never with such devastating loss of life. Rest easy, knowing you are safe from such devastation tonight. Part 7. The Galveston Hurricane and Flood. We travel now to the Gulf Coast of Texas, to the island city of Galveston, which in 1900 was struck by the deadliest natural disaster in American history, a hurricane that generated a catastrophic storm surge, drowning the city beneath 15 feet of water. At the turn of the 20th century, Galveston was one of the wealthiest cities in America. This barrier island just off the Texas coast was the state's largest city and most important port. Cotton, cattle, and grain flowed through Galveston to markets around the world. The city boasted electric streetlights, telephones, and beautiful Victorian architecture. It was called the Wall Street of the South. But Galveston had a fundamental vulnerability. It was built on a barrier island barely above sea level. The island's highest point was only 8.7 feet above mean sea level. Most of the city was lower. This meant that even moderate storm surges could flood large portions of the city. Galvestonians were well aware of this vulnerability. The city had experienced damaging hurricanes before, but there was a belief that Galveston was somehow protected, that no storm could truly devastate such a prosperous, important city. This confidence was bolstered by the city's chief meteorologist, Isaac Klein, who had published articles arguing that a devastating hurricane hitting Galveston was impossible. On September 8, 1900, Klein would learn how wrong he had been. The hurricane that struck Galveston that day was a massive Category 4 storm, with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour, but it was the storm surge, not the wind, that proved most deadly. As the hurricane approached, it pushed water ahead of it like a gigantic plough. This water piled up against the shallow continental shelf and the Texas coastline. When the eye of the hurricane reached Galveston, the storm surge was over 15 feet high, higher than any point on the island. The surge came from the south, from the Gulf of Mexico. It swept across the island with terrifying speed. Within hours, the entire city was underwater. Let the rhythm of waves lull you deeper into restful sleep. The people of Galveston had little warning. Telegraph lines went down early in the storm, cutting off communication with the mainland. There was no way to evacuate once the storm reached the island. People were trapped. As the water rose, residents fled to upper floors of buildings, but many buildings couldn't withstand the combination of wind, water, and debris. Houses collapsed, dumping their occupants into the raging floodwaters. Strong swimmers were battered to death by debris. Families were torn apart, never to be reunited. The debris itself became a deadly force. As buildings disintegrated, the wreckage created massive floating rafts of timber, metal, and household goods. These debris rafts crashed into surviving buildings, smashing them apart. People clung to pieces of wreckage, trying to stay afloat in the dark, turbulent water. Isaac Klein, the meteorologist who had assured everyone that such a disaster was impossible, watched his own house disintegrate around him. His pregnant wife drowned in the flood. Klein survived by clinging to wreckage, along with his 3 daughters and brother. The experience shattered his confidence and haunted him for the rest of his life. As night fell, the nightmare intensified. In the darkness, with the wind still howling and the rain still falling, survivors couldn't see the dangers around them. They didn't know if the water was still rising. They didn't know if the building they were in would be the next to collapse. They could only cling to whatever they could find and pray for dawn. Some survivors told of moments of surreal beauty amid the horror. Brief breaks in the clouds revealed stars overhead. The phosphorescence in the churning water created an eerie glow. But these moments of beauty were overwhelmed by the sounds, the screaming wind, the crashing of buildings, and worst of all, the cries of people calling for help that no one could provide. When dawn finally came and the storm passed, the survivors emerged to find their city destroyed. Nothing was left of entire neighborhoods. The prosperous downtown was a wasteland of shattered buildings and scattered debris. Bodies were everywhere, in the wreckage, in the water, piled against what remained of buildings. The death toll was staggering. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people died, roughly a quarter of the city's population. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Entire families were wiped out. Hundreds of children were orphaned. The loss was beyond comprehension. Let these sorrows wash away as you drift deeper into peaceful slumber. The aftermath of the Galveston hurricane was nearly as horrific as the storm itself. In the heat of September, with thousands of bodies scattered across the city, disease became a serious threat. The bodies had to be disposed of, quickly. Initially, authorities tried to give the dead a proper burial at sea. Bodies were loaded onto barges, taken out into the Gulf, weighted and dropped overboard. But the weights weren't sufficient. The bodies kept washing back to shore with the tide, a grotesque reminder of the disaster. Finally, authorities made the grim decision to burn the bodies. Funeral pyres burned across the city for weeks. The smell of burning flesh hung over Galveston long after the last body was cremated. Survivors were traumatized not just by the hurricane but by this macabre aftermath. But Galveston's survivors were determined to rebuild. Within days of the disaster, they were clearing debris and beginning reconstruction. They decided that Galveston would not only rebuild but would make sure such a catastrophe could never happen again. The solution was ambitious. They would raise the entire city above the level of any possible storm surge. It was one of the greatest engineering projects of the era. First, they built a massive seawall along the Gulf side of the island, a concrete barrier 17 feet high, 16 feet thick at its base, and initially 3.3 miles long. This seawall was designed to break the force of any storm surge. Then came an even more ambitious project. They would raise the grade of the entire city. Over 2,000 buildings were lifted on jacks, supported on stilts, while dredges pumped sand from the Gulf of Mexico beneath them. Some buildings were raised over 16 feet. The process took 7 years and moved over 16 million cubic yards of sand. Streets that had been at sea level were now elevated. Buildings that had been street level were now approached by stairs leading up from the new grade. The entire city's elevation was increased. The seawall and grade raising saved Galveston from future disasters. When major hurricanes struck in 1915 and again in later years, the city suffered damage but never again experienced catastrophic loss of life. However, the 1900 hurricane marked the end of Galveston's era as Texas's preeminent city. The disaster convinced many businesses and residents to relocate to Houston, which was inland and protected from hurricanes. Houston would go on to become Texas's largest city, while Galveston never fully recovered its former prominence. The story of Galveston is one of both terrible tragedy and remarkable resilience. The city that drowned in 1900 literally raised itself up and survived. Rest now, safe and elevated above all dangers. Part 8. The Yangtze River Flood of 1931. We return now to China, to the Yangtze River Valley, where in 1931 occurred what many historians consider the deadliest natural disaster of the 20th century. Floods that killed between 1 and 4 million people. The Yangtze River is the third longest river in the world and the longest in Asia. It drains a massive watershed, an area of nearly 700,000 square miles. For thousands of years, Chinese civilization has flourished along its banks, but the Yangtze, like the Yellow River to the north, is prone to devastating floods. The winter of 1930-31 was unusually heavy with snow in the mountains that feed the Yangtze. Spring 1931 brought heavy rains. The snowmelt and rain swelled the river beyond its banks. Then, in July, a series of cyclones struck central China, bringing torrential rains. The Yangtze and its tributaries couldn't handle the volume of water. Dikes began to fail. Cities and towns flooded. As one area flooded, it pushed water into adjacent areas, causing more dikes to fail in a cascade of disasters. Wuhan, a major city at the confluence of the Yangtze and Han rivers, was particularly hard hit. The city was underwater for nearly 4 months. At the peak of the flooding, only the tops of buildings were visible above the water. People lived in these upper stories, surrounded by a vast inland sea. Nanjing, then China's capital, was also severely flooded. Government buildings were inundated. Records and documents were destroyed. The government's ability to respond to the disaster was crippled by the fact that it was itself flooded. The flooding extended across a vast area. An estimated 70,000 square miles were underwater, an area roughly the size of England and Wales combined. Approximately 50 million people were directly affected. Let yourself float on these vast waters, drifting peacefully. The immediate death toll from drowning was horrific. Entire villages were swept away when dikes failed, giving residents no chance to escape. People caught in the open when flood struck had nowhere to go. The flat river plains offered no high ground for refuge. But the drownings were only the beginning. The floods destroyed the summer harvest completely. Without food, and with transportation networks destroyed by the flooding, famine spread across the flooded region. People ate bark, roots, anything they could find. Stories emerged of cannibalism in the worst affected areas. Disease followed famine. Cholera, typhoid and dysentery spread through the refugee camps and flooded cities. Drinking water was contaminated with sewage and decaying bodies. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The sick died in vast numbers. The exact death toll will never be known. The Chinese government at the time estimated 2 million deaths, but many scholars believe the true number was higher, perhaps as high as 4 million. Some died in the initial flooding. More died of starvation in the months that followed. Still more died of disease in the camps and flooded cities. The social and economic impacts were staggering. Millions of people were displaced, becoming refugees in their own country. Agricultural production collapsed, leading to food shortages that extended far beyond the flooded region. The economic damage was estimated at over $1 billion, equivalent to roughly $18 billion today. The flooding also had significant political consequences. The Chinese nationalist government's inability to effectively respond to the disaster undermined its legitimacy. The Communist Party, though still relatively weak at this time, gained support by organising relief efforts in areas the government couldn't reach. Some historians argue that the 1931 floods contributed to the eventual communist victory in China's civil war. International relief efforts were organised, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed them. The affected area was simply too large, the number of victims too great. Much of the aid never reached those who needed it most, either stolen by bandits or diverted by corrupt officials. The floods finally began to recede in November 1931, after 4 months of inundation. But the recovery would take years. Farmland had to be reclaimed and desalinated. Dikes had to be rebuilt. Cities had to be drained and cleaned. Millions of refugees had to be resettled. The 1931 Yangtze floods demonstrated the terrible vulnerability of low-lying river plains to flooding, especially in regions with large populations and intensive agriculture. It showed that even the most populous nation on Earth could be brought to its knees by the power of water. Rest now, your breath flowing in and out like gentle tides. Part 9. The North Sea Flood of 1953. We return to Northern Europe, to the Netherlands, Belgium and Eastern England, where in February 1953 a catastrophic storm surge breached dikes and flooded coastal areas, killing over 2,500 people. The Netherlands has always had a precarious relationship with water. Much of the country lies below sea level, protected from the North Sea only by an elaborate system of dikes, dunes and barriers. The Dutch have been managing water for centuries, but they've never been able to fully eliminate the risk. On the night of January 30th, 1953, a powerful storm formed over the North Atlantic and moved toward northern Europe. This storm combined with high tides to create a catastrophic storm surge, a rise in sea level of over 18 feet above normal. The surge struck during the night when people were asleep. This timing proved deadly. There was little warning. The surge hit with tremendous force, overwhelming the dikes that had protected the coast for generations. In the Netherlands, the province of Zeeland was particularly hard hit. The surge breached dikes in numerous locations. Seawater poured through the gaps, flooding the low-lying polders, areas of reclaimed land protected by dikes. Within hours, large parts of Zeeland were underwater. The water came swiftly in darkness. Many people had no warning until they heard the roar of water or felt it seeping into their homes. By then, it was often too late to escape. People fled to attics and rooftops, but many buildings collapsed under the force of the water. Families were separated in the chaos. The weak, the elderly, the sick, children drowned in their beds. Princess Juliana, heir to the Dutch throne, flew over the flooded areas the next day and reportedly wept at the devastation. Entire villages had disappeared. Farmland was completely submerged. Bodies floated among the wreckage. Let these dark waters recede from your mind as you sink into deeper rest. The flooding in the Netherlands killed 1,136 people. Over 70,000 people were evacuated from their homes. More than 200,000 hectares of land were flooded with seawater. Tens of thousands of farm animals drowned. The economic damage was catastrophic. But the Netherlands was not the only victim. In England, the east coast suffered severe flooding. The surge pushed up the Thames estuary, flooding coastal communities. In the town of Canvey Island, 58 people died when the sea defences were breached. Along the east coast, over 300 people died. Belgium also suffered significant flooding, with 28 deaths and extensive damage to coastal areas. The response to the disaster was swift and massive. In the Netherlands, the military was mobilised immediately. They rescued stranded people from rooftops and attics. They worked to plug the breached dikes and pump out the flooded polders. International aid poured in, with ships, helicopters, and supplies arriving from across Europe and North America. But draining the flooded land would take months. The seawater had contaminated the soil, making it unsuitable for agriculture. It would take years for the salt to be washed out and the land to become productive again. The 1953 flood was a wake-up call for the Netherlands. The existing dikes and sea defences, some dating back centuries, were clearly inadequate. A new approach was needed. The result was the Delta Works, one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history. Over the next several decades, the Netherlands would build a series of massive dams, surge barriers, and reinforced dikes to protect the coast from future storm surges. The Oosterscheldekering, completed in 1986, is perhaps the most impressive component. This massive storm surge barrier can close to protect the inland waters during storms, but remains open normally to preserve the tidal ecosystem. It's considered one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The delta works have successfully protected the Netherlands from subsequent storms. Storm surges that would have caused catastrophic flooding in 1953 now cause only minor problems. The project demonstrated that with sufficient engineering and investment, even a nation largely below sea level can protect itself from the sea. But the delta works also represent a massive commitment of resources and ongoing maintenance. The barriers must be constantly monitored and maintained. As sea levels rise due to climate change, the Netherlands continues to invest in improving its water management systems. The story of the 1953 North Sea flood and the subsequent delta works shows both human vulnerability to water-related disasters and humanity's ability to adapt and protect itself through engineering and determination. Feel protected, secure, as you drift deeper into sleep. Part 10. New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. We come now to more recent history, to August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast of the United States, and the resulting flood devastated New Orleans, killing over 1,800 people and causing over $125 billion in damage. New Orleans has always been a city at risk. Built in a natural bowl between Lake Pontchartrain to the north and the Mississippi River to the south, much of the city lies below sea level. The city is protected by a complex system of levees, flood walls, and pumping stations. Without these, much of New Orleans would be uninhabitable. New Orleanians have always known their city is vulnerable. Hurricanes are a regular threat. The city has flooded before, but there was confidence in the levee system maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers. The levees would hold. They had to hold. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall near New Orleans as a strong Category 3 hurricane. The storm surge was massive, over 25 feet high in some areas. As the surge pushed into the narrow channels and waterways around New Orleans, it concentrated and increased. The levees and flood walls, some dating back decades, weren't designed to handle such forces. In multiple locations, they failed catastrophically. Water poured into the city. The lower Ninth Ward, one of New Orleans' historically African-American neighborhoods, was devastated. A surge from the Industrial Canal breached the levee, sending a wall of water crashing through the neighborhood. Houses were ripped from their foundations. Residents who hadn't evacuated were caught by surprise. Some drowned in their homes. Others were swept away by the surge. In Lakeview, another New Orleans neighborhood, a flood wall along the 17th Street Canal failed. Water poured through the breach, flooding the neighborhood within hours. People fled to their attics and then to their roofs as the water rose. They waited there, in the August heat, for rescue that was sometimes days in coming. All told, approximately 80% of New Orleans flooded. Some areas were under 15 feet of water. The city's famous French Quarter, on slightly higher ground, escaped severe flooding, but most of the city's residential areas were inundated. Let these recent waters remind you of rest, not disaster. The response to Katrina was famously chaotic and inadequate. The city's emergency management plans failed almost immediately. Communication broke down. First responders were overwhelmed. The Superdome and Convention Center, designated as shelters of last resort, became scenes of squalor and desperation. Perhaps most shocking to many Americans was the sight of thousands of people, mostly poor and African American, stranded without help. The Coast Guard conducted daring helicopter rescues, plucking people from rooftops. But many waited days for rescue. Some didn't survive the wait. The flooding revealed and exacerbated deep inequalities in American society. Those with resources had evacuated before the storm. Those without, the poor, the elderly, those without cars, were left behind. The failure to protect these vulnerable citizens became a national scandal. The death toll from Katrina and its aftermath exceeded per 1,600 people. Most died in Louisiana, primarily in the flooding of New Orleans. But Mississippi and Alabama also suffered casualties from the storm surge. Entire coastal communities in Mississippi were scoured clean by the surge, leaving only concrete slabs where houses had stood. The economic damage was staggering. New Orleans was essentially destroyed as a functioning city. Hundreds of thousands of residents were displaced, many never to return. Entire neighbourhoods were abandoned. The city's population, which had been nearly 500,000 before Katrina, dropped to barely 200,000. The recovery has been long and incomplete. Many neighbourhoods have never fully recovered. The city's population has slowly grown but remains well below pre-Katrina levels. The social fabric of the city was torn, with communities scattered across the country. The levee system has been rebuilt and upgraded with over $14 billion invested in improvements. The new system is designed to withstand a storm surge with a 100-year return period, more protection than before, but still not absolute protection. Katrina was a watershed moment in American consciousness about flood risk and disaster preparedness. It showed that even a wealthy, developed nation could be devastated by flooding. It demonstrated the importance of maintaining infrastructure. It revealed the consequences of inequality and inadequate emergency planning. Rest now, elevated above all waters, safe and dry. Part 11. Mumbai Floods of 2005. In the same year as Katrina, halfway around the world, Mumbai, India, experienced its own devastating flood. On July 26, 2005, the city received over 37 inches of rain in just 24 hours, the highest rainfall ever recorded in a single day in any Indian city. Mumbai, a city of over 20 million people, is built on reclaimed land along the Arabian Sea coast. The city is naturally prone to flooding even during normal monsoons, but the rainfall on July 26th was anything but normal. The drainage systems, many dating from the British colonial era, were completely overwhelmed. Water accumulated faster than it could drain away. Streets became rivers. Low-lying areas became lakes. The city ground to a halt. The flooding was most severe in the suburbs, where drainage infrastructure was even more inadequate than in the city centre. In areas like Kurla and Nehru Nagar, water depths exceeded 6 feet. People were trapped in their homes. Those who ventured out found themselves wading through chest-deep water, struggling against strong currents. Public transportation collapsed. Trains, the lifeline of Mumbai, stopped running. Buses were abandoned as water flooded their engines. Taxis disappeared from the streets. Millions of people were stranded, at their workplaces, at train stations, wherever they happened to be when the flooding became impassable. As night fell, the situation became more desperate. With no way to get home, thousands of people took shelter wherever they could find it, in shops, offices, train stations, anywhere dry. The more fortunate were taken in by strangers offering shelter. Others spent the night on tables, counters, or any elevated surface they could find, surrounded by water. The death toll exceeded 1,000 people. Some drowned in the floodwaters, others were electrocuted by fallen power lines. Still others died when buildings weakened by water collapsed. In the chaos, many deaths went unreported. Let your breath flow like gentle rain, peaceful and regular. The Mumbai floods revealed deep structural problems in the city's infrastructure and planning. The drainage system, designed for a much smaller city and normal monsoon rains, was completely inadequate for modern Mumbai and extreme weather events. Rapid, unplanned development had made the problem worse. Wetlands that had naturally absorbed water had been filled in for construction. Natural drainage channels had been blocked or diverted. The city's immense population density turned the flooding into a humanitarian crisis. In the crowded slums where millions of Mumbai's poorest residents live, the flooding was particularly devastating. Flimsy shelters were washed away. Narrow lanes became raging torrents. People lost what little they had. The floods also revealed the city's resilience and the mutual support of its residents. Stories emerged of people helping strangers, of restaurants feeding the stranded for free, of businesses opening their doors as shelters. Despite the chaos and tragedy, the human spirit of Mumbai shone through. In the aftermath, there were calls for major infrastructure upgrades. Plans were drawn up to improve drainage, to preserve wetlands, to better manage the city's water. Some of these plans have been implemented, but progress has been slow. Mumbai continues to flood during heavy monsoons, though not as catastrophically as in 2005. The 2005 Mumbai floods were a stark reminder that flooding is not just a problem for developed nations with sophisticated infrastructure. Some of the world's most vulnerable cities are in developing nations where rapid urbanization has outpaced infrastructure development. Climate change, which is increasing the intensity of extreme rainfall events, threatens to make the problem worse. Cities like Mumbai, built on coastal lowlands and home to millions of poor people living in vulnerable conditions, face enormous challenges in protecting their residents from floods. The solutions require not just engineering, but addressing poverty, inequality, and unplanned development, challenges far more complex than building dikes or levees. Feel yourself safe from Mumbai's monsoons, dry and comfortable. Part 12. The Boxing Day Tsunami. We turn now to a different kind of flood. Not from rain or rivers, but from the sea itself, driven by forces deep beneath the ocean floor. On December 26, 2004, an underwater earthquake off the coast of Sumatra triggered a tsunami that devastated coastal communities around the Indian Ocean, killing over 230,000 people. The earthquake was one of the most powerful ever recorded, magnitude 9.1. It occurred when the Indian tectonic plate slid beneath the Burma plate, causing a rupture over 800 miles long. This sudden movement displaced an enormous volume of water, creating waves that would travel across the entire Indian Ocean. In the deep ocean, tsunami waves are hardly noticeable. They're only a few feet high, but they travel at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. As they approach shallow coastal waters, they slow down and pile up, creating towering walls of water. The tsunami struck with little warning. In Aceh, Indonesia, the closest major population centre to the earthquake's epicentre, the waves arrived within 15 minutes. People felt the earthquake but didn't understand what it meant. Some went to the beach to investigate the strange phenomenon of the sea rapidly receding. They were still there when the wave struck. The first wave was often not the largest. After the initial wave, the sea would recede again, pulling water, debris and people back out to sea. Then another wave would strike, then another. In some places, waves continued for hours. In Banda Aceh, the provincial capital of Aceh, waves over 100 feet high struck the coast. Entire neighbourhoods were obliterated. The city's infrastructure, roads, bridges, hospitals, was destroyed. Ships were thrown inland, ending up hundreds of yards from the sea. The death toll in Aceh alone exceeded 160,000 people. Let these waves wash over you, carrying you deeper into peaceful sleep. But the tsunami didn't stop at Indonesia. It spread across the Indian Ocean, striking Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and even reaching the coast of Africa. In Thailand, the popular tourist beaches of Phuket and Khao Lak were crowded with vacationers, enjoying the perfect beach weather. Most had no idea what a tsunami was. When the water receded, some walked out onto the exposed seabed, picking up stranded fish. Then the waves struck. Video footage from Thailand shows tourists on the beach, filming the approaching wave, not understanding the danger until it was too late. The waves swept people away, smashed through hotels and restaurants, and flooded inland. Over 8,000 people died in Thailand, about half of them foreign tourists. Sri Lanka suffered terribly as well. The island nation was struck by waves on both its eastern and southern coasts. Over 35,000 people died. Entire fishing villages were wiped out. A passenger train carrying over 1,500 people was struck by the tsunami, killing most of those aboard in what remains the deadliest train disaster in history. On India's southeastern coast, waves struck Tamil Nadu and other coastal states. Over 10,000 people died. Fishing. Communities that had existed for generations were destroyed in minutes. The tsunami even reached the coast of Somalia in Africa, 3,000 miles from the earthquake's epicenter. Though the waves had lost much of their power, they still killed over 300 people. The death toll from the 2004 tsunami exceeded 230,000 people from at least 14 countries. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. The suffering was compounded by the fact that it struck during a holiday season when many people were travelling or gathered in coastal areas. The lack of warning was perhaps the tragedy's most heartbreaking aspect. The technology to detect tsunamis existed, and a warning system operated in the Pacific Ocean. But no such system existed in the Indian Ocean. Scientists detected the earthquake and knew it could generate a tsunami, but there was no way to warn people in the affected areas. By the time anyone could have been warned, the waves had already struck. Rest easy, far from threatened shores tonight. In the aftermath of the tsunami, an international relief effort mobilized. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed local authorities in every affected nation. International aid organisations, militaries, and individual volunteers poured into the region. The recovery was immense and is still ongoing in some areas. Entire cities had to be rebuilt. Fisheries and agricultural land had been contaminated with salt water. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, living in temporary shelters for months or years. One positive outcome was the establishment of the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System. Ocean bottom sensors and seismic monitors were deployed throughout the Indian Ocean. Communication networks were established to quickly disseminate warnings. Educational programs taught coastal communities to recognise tsunami warning signs and how to respond. The 2004 tsunami changed how the world thinks about tsunami risk. Coastal communities worldwide have reassessed their vulnerability. Warning systems have been upgraded. Building codes have been changed to make structures more resistant to tsunami forces. Evacuation routes and shelters have been established. But the fundamental vulnerability remains. Hundreds of millions of people live in coastal areas vulnerable to tsunamis. When the next major tsunami strikes, likely somewhere in the Pacific Ring of Fire, the death toll could be equally catastrophic unless people heed warnings and evacuate. The 2004 tsunami was a stark reminder that the sea, which has given humanity so much, can also take everything away. The power of water, driven by geological forces beyond human control, can devastate our mightiest cities and claim hundreds of thousands of lives in a single day. Let these waters recede from your thoughts, leaving only peace. Part 13. The Great Flood of 1993. We return to the United States, to the summer of 1993, when the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and their tributaries flooded vast areas of the Midwest, creating what became known as the Great Flood of 1993. The flood was caused by persistent heavy rainfall throughout the spring and summer of 1993. The ground became saturated. Rivers and streams filled to capacity, and still, it kept raining. The Mississippi River system drains water from 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces, over 40% of the continental United States. When that entire watershed receives excessive rain simultaneously, the result is catastrophic flooding. By June, rivers throughout the Midwest were at flood stage, but instead of cresting and receding, they kept rising. Levees that had protected communities for decades were overtopped or breached. Towns and farmland flooded. By July, the situation had become a disaster of historic proportions. In some areas, rivers remained above flood stage for months. The Mississippi River at St. Louis, Missouri, was above flood stage for 144 consecutive days. At its peak, the river reached 49.6 feet, nearly 20 feet above flood stage. The flooding affected 9 states, but Iowa, Illinois, Missouri and Wisconsin were hardest hit. Approximately 50,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. An estimated 15 million acres of farmland were inundated. 50 people died. Let the floodwaters recede from your mind as sleep approaches. The Great Flood of 1993 was particularly notable for the number of levees that failed. Over 1,000 levees were breached or overtopped. These included not just agricultural levees, but also levees protecting towns and cities. When a levee fails, the results can be catastrophic. The water doesn't seep through gradually, it bursts through with tremendous force. Communities behind failed levees can be flooded within minutes, often with little or no warning. The town of Valmeyer, Illinois experienced this firsthand. When the levee protecting the town failed, 90% of the buildings were flooded. The damage was so extensive that the entire town was relocated to higher ground, a process that took several years. Some communities made the controversial decision to deliberately breach levees to relieve pressure on downstream areas. These decisions saved some communities at the expense of flooding agricultural land, and sometimes other communities. The moral and legal complexities of these decisions caused conflicts that lasted for years. The economic impact of the flood exceeded $15 billion. The agricultural losses were particularly severe. The flooded farmland included some of the most productive agricultural land in the United States. Crops were destroyed, soil was eroded or contaminated with debris. It took years for some farmland to fully recover. Transportation was severely disrupted. Major highways and rail lines were flooded or damaged. Barge traffic on the Mississippi, a crucial transportation route for bulk commodities, was halted for weeks. The economic ripple effects extended far beyond the flooded areas. the Great Flood of 1993 prompted a major re-evaluation of flood control policy in the United States. For decades, the approach had been to build levees to keep rivers confined to their channels. The 1993 flood demonstrated the limitations of this approach. Some levees, it became clear, create a false sense of security. People build in floodplains behind levees, believing they're protected, but levees can fail, and when they do, the people who trusted them can be trapped. In the aftermath of the flood, some communities and farmland were deliberately converted back to wetlands and floodplains. The idea was to give rivers more room, to allow controlled flooding in less developed areas to protect more populated areas downstream. It was a recognition that sometimes the best flood control is to work with rivers rather than against them. Feel the rhythm of rivers, now gentle and peaceful, carrying you towards sleep. Part 14, The Indus River Floods of 2010. We travel now to Pakistan, where in the summer of 2010, unprecedented monsoon rains caused the Indus River and its tributaries to flood, affecting over 20 million people in what became one of the worst natural disasters in the nation's history. The monsoon rains began in late July 2010 and were immediately heavier than normal. The province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in northwest Pakistan received rain that was 200% above normal levels. The Swat, Kabul and Indus rivers rapidly overflowed their banks. The flooding began in the north and moved south, following the course of the Indus River. As it moved downstream, the flood picked up more water from tributaries. The wave of floodwater could be tracked moving down the country over a period of weeks. Entire villages were swept away in the initial flooding in the northwest. The residents had little warning. The water came at night in many cases, catching people while they slept. Houses made of mud brick dissolved in the floodwaters. People and animals were swept away. As the flood moved south through Punjab and Sindh provinces, it spread across a wider area. Millions of acres of agricultural land were inundated. The Indus River, normally a few miles wide, spread to over 20 miles wide in some areas. From satellite images, the flooded area looked like an inland sea stretching for hundreds of miles. Let your breathing slow, deep and regular like distant rivers. Over 20 million people were affected by the flooding, more than the combined total affected by the 2004 tsunami, the 2005 Kashmir earthquake, and the 2010 Haiti earthquake. Nearly 2,000 people died. Over 1.5 million homes were destroyed or damaged. 7 million people were displaced from their homes. The agricultural devastation was catastrophic. Pakistan is an agricultural nation, and the floods struck during the growing season. Cotton, rice, and sugarcane crops were destroyed. Over 200,000 livestock died. The food security implications were severe. The destroyed crops represented a significant portion of Pakistan's food supply and agricultural exports. Infrastructure damage was extensive. Over 7,000 miles of roads were damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of bridges collapsed. Irrigation systems that represented decades of investment were washed away. The damage to infrastructure was estimated at over $10 billion. The humanitarian crisis was immense. Millions of people were displaced, living in makeshift camps or with relatives. Access to clean water became a critical problem. Wells and water systems were contaminated by floodwater. Waterborne diseases, including cholera, spread through the displaced population. The international response was significant but inadequate to the scale of the disaster. Aid organisations struggled to reach affected areas because of damaged infrastructure and the continued flooding. The Pakistani military played a crucial role in rescue and relief efforts, but they too were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. The recovery from the 2010 floods has been slow and incomplete. Years later, some areas had still not fully recovered. The economic impact set back Pakistan's development by years. The social impact, with millions of people displaced and impoverished, contributed to instability in an already fragile region. The 2010 Pakistan floods were a stark reminder that flooding can affect entire nations, not just cities or regions. When a major river system floods in a heavily populated and agricultural area, the consequences can be catastrophic for tens of millions of people. Rest peacefully. Rivers now distant and calm. Part 15. Venice. A city. Slowly drowning. We come now to Venice, Italy. A city built on water. A city that has spent centuries managing its relationship with the sea. A city that is slowly sinking, and may one day be claimed entirely by the waves. Venice was founded in the 5th and 6th centuries CE by refugees fleeing barbarian invasions of the Italian mainland. They settled on a group of small islands in a lagoon separated from the Adriatic Sea by a long barrier island. It seemed an unlikely place to build a city, marshy, flood-prone, with no solid ground for foundations. But the Venetians were master engineers. They drove millions of wooden pilings deep into the clay beneath the lagoon. On these pilings, they built their city of stone and marble. They learned to work with the tides, building their streets and piazzas to accommodate daily flooding. They became expert at managing water. For over 1,000 years, Venice prospered. It became one of the world's great maritime powers, controlling trade routes between Europe and the East. It became a centre of art and culture. Its unique beauty made it one of the world's most admired cities. But Venice has always flooded. The phenomenon is called aqua alta, or high water. During certain combinations of tides, winds and atmospheric pressure, seawater flows into the lagoon and floods the city. In the past, these floods were generally minor, a few inches of water in St. Mark's Square, and inconvenience but not a disaster. However, over the past century, Venice has been flooding more frequently and more severely. There are several reasons for this, and together they threaten the city's existence. Let the lapping of Venetian canals lull you towards sleep. First, Venice is sinking. The weight of the city itself compresses the soft sediments beneath it. But more significantly, during the 20th century, groundwater was pumped from beneath the city for industrial use. This caused the land to subside even faster. Though groundwater pumping was banned in the 1970s, the subsidence continues due to natural compression of sediments. At the same time, sea levels are rising due to climate change. The Adriatic Sea is rising at a rate of about 2.5 millimetres per year. This might not sound like much, but combined with the city's subsidence, it means that Venice is effectively dropping relative to sea level by about 5 millimetres per year. The result is that aqua alta events are becoming more frequent and more severe. Events that once occurred every few years now occur multiple times each year. Water levels that were once considered exceptional are now routine. In November 2019, Venice experienced its worst flooding in over 50 years. Water levels reached 1.87 metres above normal, the second highest level ever recorded. St. Mark's Basilica was flooded for only the 6th time in its 1,000-year history. Hotels, shops, and homes were inundated. Priceless artworks and historical artefacts were damaged. The mayor of Venice declared a state of disaster. He blamed climate change, saying the flooding was a consequence of human impact on the environment. The images of flooded Venice prompted international concern. Was Venice doomed? Would this unique city be lost forever? Let yourself float through Venice's canals, peaceful and serene. Venice has not given up. For decades, engineers have been working on a massive flood barrier system called MOS, Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico. This system consists of 78 floating gates that normally lie flat on the seafloor at the 3 inlets connecting the Venetian lagoon to the Adriatic Sea. When aqua alta is forecast, the gates are raised by pumping compressed air into them. They float up, creating a temporary barrier that prevents seawater from entering the lagoon. When the tide recedes, the gates are lowered again. MOS was first proposed in the 1980s, but construction didn't begin until 2003. The project has been plagued by delays, cost overruns and corruption scandals. The original cost estimate was $1.6 billion. By 2020, over $6 billion had been spent, and the system was still not fully operational. MOS was activated for the first time in October 2020, and successfully prevented flooding during several aqua alta events. It seems to work. But questions remain about its long-term viability. MOS is designed to protect Venice against sea level rise of up to 60 centimetres. If sea levels rise more than that, which many climate models predict they will, MOS will be insufficient. The gates would need to be raised so frequently that they would effectively cut the lagoon off from the sea, destroying its ecosystem and making it impossible for ships to reach Venice. There's also the question of maintenance. The gates operate in a harsh marine environment. They require constant upkeep. Will future generations have the resources and will to maintain this system? Some argue that MOS is buying time for Venice but isn't a permanent solution. Eventually, if sea levels continue to rise, Venice may become uninhabitable. The question isn't if Venice will be reclaimed by the sea, but when. For now, Venice endures. Tourists still visit, marvelling at the city's unique beauty. Venetians still live in their palaces and houses, navigating the canals as their ancestors did. But the threat of water is always present, rising slowly but inexorably. Venice is a warning to coastal cities worldwide. If even a city as wealthy, culturally significant, and determined as Venice can be threatened by rising seas, what hope is there for less fortunate places? Let Venice's twilight beauty carry you into dreams. Conclusion: the eternal dance of water and humanity. As we drift toward the edge of sleep, we reflect on these stories. Cities destroyed, civilizations ended, millions of lives lost to the power of water. Water is essential to human life. We need it to drink, to grow food, to transport goods. We're drawn to water. Most of the world's great cities are built on coasts, rivers, or lakes. We love the water. But water is also dangerous. It can rise up and destroy everything we've built. Floods, tsunamis, storm surges, these are among nature's most devastating forces. They've destroyed countless cities throughout history. They've killed tens of millions of people, and they will strike again. What these stories teach us is both sobering and inspiring. They show us human vulnerability, how even our greatest cities can be destroyed by water in a matter of hours. They demonstrate the limits of our technology and engineering. No matter how sophisticated our flood control systems, nature can overwhelm them. But these stories also show human resilience. After every catastrophic flood, survivors rebuild. Often they rebuild in the same dangerous location because the water that threatens them also sustains them. They develop better technology, build higher levees, create warning systems. They learn from each disaster and prepare better for the next one. Let these lessons wash over you, leaving only peaceful acceptance. The relationship between humanity and water is changing. Climate change is making extreme weather events more frequent and more severe. Sea levels are rising. Coastal cities face growing threats. Rivers are experiencing more extreme floods and droughts. Some cities that have been destroyed by floods were never rebuilt. Others have been rebuilt multiple times. Some, like Venice, are slowly losing the battle against rising waters. Others, like New Orleans and Galveston, have invested heavily in protection and may survive. The future will likely see more cities destroyed by floods. Coastal megacities in Asia, Shanghai, Mumbai, Bangkok, Jakarta, are particularly vulnerable. These cities are home to tens of millions of people, often including many of the world's poorest who live in the most vulnerable areas. But humanity is not helpless. We can build better flood defences. We can improve warning systems. We can plan cities to be more resilient. We can, if we choose, address the climate change that's exacerbating flood risk. Most importantly, we can learn from history. The cities destroyed by floods in the past have lessons for us today. They teach us to respect the power of water. They show us the consequences of building in dangerous places without adequate protection. They demonstrate that disaster preparation is cheaper than disaster recovery. Let these ancient lessons carry you into rest. As you drift off to sleep tonight, safe and dry in your bed, far from rising waters and devastating floods, remember these drowned cities. Remember Heracleion beneath the Mediterranean, its colossal statues lying on the seafloor. Remember Rungholt, swallowed by the North Sea in a single night. Remember Kaifeng, buried 6 times beneath layers of mud from the Yellow River. Remember Pompeii, buried not just by ash but by superheated water. Remember Johnstown, where a wall of water from a failed dam destroyed an entire city. Remember Galveston, where 6,000 people died when a hurricane surge swept over the island. Remember New Orleans flooding during Katrina. Remember Mumbai paralysed by unprecedented rain. Remember the villages of Aceh, Indonesia, swept away by the tsunami. Remember the millions displaced by Pakistan's 2010 floods. And think of Venice, still beautiful, still defiant, but slowly sinking beneath the waves it has coexisted with for 500 years. These cities are not just history. They are warnings, they are lessons. They are reminders of both our vulnerability and our resilience. The water that destroyed these cities is the same water that gave them life. The rivers that flooded were the same rivers that brought trade and prosperity. The seas that surge in storms are the same seas that connect continents and enable civilization. Water gives and water takes away. Feel your breath flowing in and out like tides, gentle and eternal. In your dreams tonight, you might walk through drowned cities. You might swim through streets where fish dart between ancient columns. You might float peacefully over submerged buildings, looking down at the remnants of civilizations past. These dreams are not nightmares. They are reminders of impermanence, of the constant change that defines existence. Cities rise and fall. Civilizations flourish and fade. What seems permanent, stone and steel and concrete, can be swept away by water in moments. But life continues. After every flood, survivors rebuild. Children are born. Crops are planted. New cities rise where old ones fell. The human story continues, shaped but not ended by water's power. As you drift deeper into sleep, let go of all tension. Let go of worry and fear. You are safe. You are dry. You are at rest. The cities destroyed by floods have lessons to teach us, but for now, those lessons can wait. For now, there is only the gentle rhythm of your breathing, only the peaceful darkness of sleep approaching, only the quiet comfort of rest. The water that destroyed those cities is far away. The floods that claimed so many lives are in the past. Tonight, there is only peace, only calm, only sleep. Let the stories of drowned cities fade like ripples on still water. Let the images of devastation dissolve like foam on the shore. Let everything except peaceful rest flow away. You are drifting now, floating supported by the gentlest of waters. Not the violent torrents that destroyed cities, but calm, peaceful water that cradles you as you sink deeper into sleep. Deeper, deeper still, into the quiet depths where there is no sound but your breathing. No movement but the rise and fall of your chest. No thought but the approach of dreams. Sleep now. Rest peacefully. Let the waters of sleep carry you away. This has been Sleepless Survivors. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the cities destroyed by floods. May you rest well and wake refreshed. Good night.